Great. So, believe it or not, we are at the end of the day. This is our last session. And given it's a last session, I'm just delighted to be talking to Paul Roehrig. And we're going to talk about monsters, right, Paul? It's going to be a lot of fun. By the way, just to introduce, Paul is the global head of strategy for Cognizant Digital and Technology Business. He's also the co-founder of Cognizant Center for the Future of Work. And I think that's been there for more than a decade, Paul. And you, along with Ben and others, have been evangelizing technology now for that amount of period. And you've just published a new book called Monster: A Tough Love Letter for on Taming Machines That Rule Our Jobs. I've read some excerpts and I hope to read it over the weekend, Paul, but it seems like a very probing and provocative new book that wrestles with technology's, strengths and weaknesses. So welcome, Paul. And the first obvious question is, why the hell write this book? Uh, and are you a glass half empty kind of a person, or a glass half full when it comes to the impact of technology on humankind?
I think, thank you for that. I think I'm more of a there's water in the glass person. So that's really what we were trying to do. So we've been quite optimistic about technology, and it is like you said around the title, it is a love letter to technology, really, because as we were talking about the last book, What to Do When Machines Do Everything, a lot of people came to us with questions that were very personal. They were very low on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They were, what should my kids study? And am I going to have a job? And are we going to have a war? And the more we worked with business leaders all over the world, the more it became clear that at the heart of everyone's concern about technology was, oh my God, have we created a monster? And so what we wanted to do was really lean into that and say what was going, maybe, some of the unintended consequences of the technology that surrounds us, and not just social media, but in every element of our lives. And then more importantly, what do we do about it? So what can, and even more specifically, what can business leaders do to build almost a manifesto, if you will, about how do we engage with technology as business people? How do we drive and lead our companies in a way that improves how we manage data and how we apply intelligence, just like some of the folks on the preceding session do. They build systems of intelligence. And that's sort of really why we wanted to write the book, because people were coming up with these really personal questions, and Ben and I just kind of listened to it, and as the more we reflected on it, it became like, well, that's the next book. And now we have it.
So I think you talk about four mantras or four decision points that business leaders need to keep in mind to tame this technology monster. Why don't you talk a little bit about those four, Paul?
Yeah, great. So one of the things that we've found in talking more and more about the business aspects of what can leaders do and what must we do to tame the monster with our own companies, not just in our personal and private lives, but with our companies. And there were really four things. And the first and probably the most important, and again, this is going to be no surprise to anybody who's been following you and Phil and the rest of the HFS team, it's all about the data, right? The core underpinning to the OneOffice paradigm is really around data and how data improves processes and experiences. And so embracing modern data stewardship is probably the number one thing to do. And there's some tactical things steps that leaders can take to do that. To make sure that decisions are rightfully being made in line with a company's values and ethics, candidly, and so that's really one of the most important things for business leaders to kind of lean into. And it's not like most leaders are going, well, I never heard anything about data before. Everyone's who's active in the modern economy is thinking about data, but there are some more steps that people can take to make sure that your companies don't end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for the wrong reasons. The second is managing the trust paradox. And this one's really kind of interesting because what we say we do is kind of different than what we actually do when we engage with technology with any company. And it's managing that paradox of all of us as consumers demanding that we trust the companies that we engage with and so managing that expectation of trust, while also recognizing that trust is never been more important, although it's now becoming more at risk, candidly, in all of our relationships with companies. So the higher expectations with the lower performance it does create a paradox that leaders have to embrace. And then the next is moving from AI to EI. So that's artificial intelligence to ethical intelligence, because there's plenty of examples now where unintended consequences around building and deploying AI have led to some bad outcomes. No other way to put it, right? So it could be embedded, unintentional but systemically embedded racism or sexism. It could be decisions that are being made based on some assumptions that turned out not to be true, and so on and so forth. And the final is recognizing the new value algorithm, where companies are more and more being valued by capital markets based on not just revenue and margin, but how fit for purpose you are for the modern economy. Again, this gets back to some of the work that HFS has been doing now for quite some time, where you're regularly advising the people who you work with to start thinking about, again, the one office philosophy. But there's a lot to unpack in that. But that one office philosophy, if you do it right, leads to improved valuation, right? And it's not just a margin and revenue, it's being fit for purpose for the modern economy. And so these four things they look simple, but there's some very chunky and tactical things that we think business leaders ought to do to be able to kind of tame the monster in a professional business context.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating, Paul. And as I look at this, as you mentioned, seemingly simple Venn diagram, it is a hugely complicated Venn diagram at the same time. And I think the challenge is, how do you do these four things together? Because I think the real magic is at the center of the intersection, that little square at the center, where all these things intersect. And that's going to be really, really hard to do, leave aside the individual bubbles. But you also wear the service provider hat, Paul, and as the strategy lead for Cognizant, what do you think service providers should do? When you look at these four bubbles.
Well, I mean, you kind of indicated what I think we should do is to be able to make this easier. Our responsibility we call it a services company. Our responsibility is to be in service of our clients, and this is taken together, right? One of the biggest shifts any of us are going to live through in terms of how technology is reshaping the landscape of economies and societies and companies and even our personal lives. And so a service provider, I think it's up to us to help clients, whether it's a bank or a retailer or an insurance company, or to help tame this, to make it, more straightforward for people managing business and technology. So, and I think you quite rightly noted that it's the intersection of these that can seem really hard. But when you get down to how do you manage data well, how do you build and engender trust with your brand and the experiences that you create, how do you deploy artificial intelligence in a way that is in line with your values as a firm, and then how can you begin to become a more modern enterprise in line with the expectations for how value is going to be generated. So when you step back and it looks maybe a little too complicated, right? But the reality is that a service provider has to be able to help clients move the needle on each one of these elements of data, trust and experience, applied intelligence, and overall modernization, process modernization, in line with new market expectations. So this is really, a big chunk of the job that the service provider of the future has to embrace, and we do.
Yeah. So I think as looking at those 4 dimensions, Paul, I'm reminded of the study that we were doing together, right? In fact, we're still working on it, called the Digital Revolution. And one of the things that's very interesting from the tranches of data that we are going through is the impact of data, right? And that was your first point there. Data is almost becoming like a survival imperative, right? Data is not a nice to have. It's sort of, without you managing the data swarms around you, it's just going to be hard to survive. Talk to us a little bit about what you wrote in the book, and maybe if you want to look at the data that we got from interviewing about 500 odd global 2000 executives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so core to taming the monster in a business context is managing data, right? All of the rest, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build trust and deploy any kind of intelligence without data, and it's impossible to modernize work or consumer experiences without embracing data and building a manifesto for managing data. And that might sound kind of theoretical, right? And so what I love about the work that Saurabh, that we've done together with HFS, is identifying this kind of finding in what came from the pandemic. Now there's a lot to unpack on this one slide. We're not going to be able to get through all of it, but the key takeaway for everybody that's hanging into the end of this is that 80% of respondents, and this is a global study, said that managing, monetizing, and leading with data is, like you said, it's not just a nice thing to have, right? It's not just, it's not optional. It's now mandatory for survival. Now, if you can look over on the right, you can see kind of the breakdown. It was, 20%-ish said it was a survival. Why are you even asking this? It's been a survival imperative. But look at the number of folks that said that the COVID shock has made it a survival imperative. And then even more, it's like within 2 years, which means if you're not running down the track right now, it's time to get moving. So that is building that data manifesto, right? Liberating data. Most companies have plenty of data. They may not have the right data, but it's too expensive. It may not be secure, private, compliant, and most importantly, it may not be accessible. And so a service provider of the future, and this is again in line with a lot of the work that HFS has been doing, has to be able to deliver this in a straightforward way, in a demystified way to clients all over the world. This is one of the most important findings of our study, and it's exactly in line with the larger narrative that we wrote about in the book Monster.
Yeah, no, I think the other thing that fascinated me, Paul, was, I think you called it the fit for future metrics, and for success. And if you look at how we measure enterprise success, it's largely driven by revenues or bottom line, or maybe valuation, right, is starting to come through. But I think traditional bookkeeping, traditional accounting measures, traditional ways of measures perhaps don't tell the full story, right? There is a lot of other somewhat hidden factors that drives a successful or an unsuccessful company, right? Take from things like sustainability to things like customer experience to a whole host of other other factors. Uh, what's been your experience on, what is this fit for purpose, fit for future enterprise? How does that look like?
Well, look, I mean, yeah, it's a super important point. I mean, it comes down to, with the rise of the kind of the digital economy, if we can use that word, you can see these companies, several companies, right, that we know, that are not conforming to the normal margin and revenue balance, and the valuations are going through the roof, right? Tesla, Salesforce, right? So these companies are more software centric in many cases, and so the reason they're getting that kind of valuation is because the markets are assessing their ability to be relevant in the future. That's what's getting priced into those stocks, and it's driving valuations through the roof. And so that is the new value algorithm. So even if 100-year-old companies now are being much more proactive in saying, what are the fit for future, the measures of relevance, if you will, what are those, and how are we moving the needle around that? Sustainability that you mentioned, inclusion, another thing. How are you investing and accruing money through digitally influenced channels? Are you modernizing fast enough? You can see companies in the market that are punished even when they're doing an okay job in managing revenue and margin, if they're not fulfilling public expectations around the being fit for the future. That is being priced into the stock performance, right? So for publicly traded companies, this is an absolute boardroom C-suite imperative. So business and technology leaders are getting much more proactive now in trying to understand, how do we innovate faster? How do we become more agile? How do we become more inclusive? How do we value and act on our values around sustainability? So all of those metrics now that used to be kind of like what you get, it's maybe a generalization, but if you're overly indexing on pure dollars and cents in the near term, you might miss the longer term play, and that's going to punish companies, right? That becoming fit for the future, using new technology, modernizing processes, modernizing consumer experiences. That's really the path ahead to being successful and relevant in the modern economy.
Yeah, Paul, look, I would have loved to continue this conversation for the next 3 hours, but I've been told that our time is up. But thank you so much for spending some time with us. I'm pretty sure a lot of people will go to Amazon today and buy your new book. But I think my takeaway is that we need to find a new algorithm to tame this monster.
Well,
Right?
we're doing it together, right? The work that we've done together, I think, has been fantastic, and you've been terrific. So I can't wait for that stuff to come out. It's going to be, I think everybody will like it.
All right. Thanks, Paul, and thanks a lot. And back to Phil now to wrap this wonderful day up.
Thanks, Saurabh.